Protect your wooden clarinet and get the most out of your reeds with Boveda two-way humidity control packs. Watch until the end of this video to learn more. Then head to bovedainc.com and use code Clarineat at checkout to save 10% on your next purchase of Boveda products. Okay, everyone listening, so thank you for tuning in. It looks like we've got a couple live people today checking out the Clarineat live podcast, which is great. This is a learning experience for everyone involved, including me. I've just recently, within 2 episodes, switched the podcast to a live version. This is the second one. I learned a couple things last time. My mic was too hot, so sorry about that. If you listened to that episode, I'm trying to fix the audio problems. And also, I realized I got to look at the camera if I'm talking to the audience. So I got my guests here on my huge wide screen and my questions and all sorts of stuff. But if I'm talking to the audience, there's the camera. I should be looking at that. Lesson learned. Anyway, so we do have a fantastic guest today, Tommaso Lonquich, who is an international soloist and many other things, actually, chamber musician. He's done all kinds of stuff with music, but he's recently also added a second career path, which we're going to talk about today. Since we last talked in 2017, I believe it was, so amazingly 5 years ago, which I can't really believe, back when the podcast was in double digits still. So much has changed. You're also a father now, and I'm a father of 2 children in that time. So it's everything has changed. So I can't wait to discuss not only kind of a life update from Tommaso, but to hear about his new and second career path, which it sounds like is probably not something you'd expect at all. But also just about being a father and juggling all these life commitments, which is surely something that I am experiencing myself. So Tommaso, welcome back to the program.
Great to be back with you, Sean.
So I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. As I said, let's just dive in kind of for an update. I mean, I can't believe it's been 5 years, half a decade. It literally feels like yesterday that we last talked. So
Definitely.
How's it going? And tell me about your being a father and your new career path and everything that's happened in that time.
Yeah, I mean, a lot happened, right, in the world, but also in our personal lives, of course. Yeah, I guess, of course, fatherhood was one thing. It coincided with the pandemic for me. So it actually was both a little unnerving, and at the same time, it made the pandemic time kind of beautiful with a little daughter on the way. So that was a part of it. Another silver lining that came with the pandemic was the fact that a lot of things moved on Zoom. Which was, of course, not so pleasant for us musicians to play for microphones or to have so few events, so few live events. But for me, one of the positive things is that I could continue an education, a training that I had started back in 2010 to become a Lacanian psychoanalyst. And I had started that when I was in Madrid, living there, and there was a very good training center there. And then I had to interrupt that passion and that career path because my life took me elsewhere with music, and the places where I was living didn't have that same kind of training possibilities available. With the pandemic also came the possibility of continuing that education, because my very same old school that I had studied in began to offer all the courses also online. So I could actually continue and do my second, third, and fourth year of specialization. And I'm finishing that in these weeks. In the end of June, I'll be done with the full specialization. So that's something that was one of the things that was unexpected. Together with the pandemic came also this possibility to expand a little bit in another direction. Yeah. This is in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's a lot has changed. And you know what? When we last talked, there's no way we could have even guessed all the changes that would happen in the next 5 years. I mean, not to mention, personal and family changes, but like the whole world. And I mean, I'll never forget, just before the new year in 2019, end of 2019, I put out some episode about how to make 2020 your best year ever or something. And it was the last time I made like a solo episode like that, because I was like, I don't want to look what happened. Did I somehow cause all this? It's crazy. Because I don't know many people who 2020 was their best year ever. Surely not. So, yeah. But you're right. There's been so much kind of perspective shift for many. There's been a lot of people who have segued into, I don't want to say double lives, but they do have multiple opportunities in different careers now, because maybe over the pandemic, they started up a secondary business. just to get by or to pursue a new interest or even just to focus more on family, I suppose. But I mean, I know musicians who are now realtors. I know musicians who are now baking sourdough bread to supplement their income with like a subscription service that works out pretty well for them actually. So it's been very interesting for a lot of people. They've really kind of changed their ways. But becoming a psychoanalyst, this is a totally different level of taking that to the next level. So could you just walk me through like what is that? I mean, I'm not that familiar with this entire branch of education, of course, but what does that look like as a job day to day? Like, what is the path that would become of that study? And where do you see yourself kind of in 5 years as far as balancing your music career with this secondary career that you've added?
Right. Well, as any job that you have kind of in the mental health side of things, you are dealing with patients coming in. In my case, it would be private practice, but it can be also in a psychiatric hospital setting or in other public settings. People that come in with all kinds of problematics, and of course, the job of any psychotherapist or psychoanalyst or psychiatrist is to try to find a solution together with obviously within different schools and different methods and different orientation. Um, yes, in a way, it's quite dissimilar from music. Um, there are many differences. On the other side, it's not so dissimilar in that, of course, it has to do with, in a certain way, listening to a score or even reading a score. When the patient comes in um, with their narrative, with their life story, with their problems, aims, wishes, desires, and so on, they are laying in front of us therapists a kind of score. I really think of it that way, and it's the capacity of the listener uh, to offer the silence and the very attentive listening capability, which allows this to unfold and to become something of meaning and of change for the person, in this case on the couch in analysis. Um, so it is about bringing out um, the subjectivity of the people that come to us. And in that way, I think it's not so dissimilar from music, especially the teaching of music, where I always try to work together with a student so that we may let something be born which wasn't there before and which is very specific to the meeting place between that young artist and the composer. But that's not standardized, repeatable, or in a series. It's really something that's born out of that student, their life story, their aesthetics. So I think there is something of a honoring the subjectivity of the people that come to see an analyst, which is similar to the subjectivity that we honor when we make music.
I love that. It's a fascinating way of looking at it. And I almost wonder if more people who go into healthcare or other facets of psychology and psychoanalysts, things like this, if they would benefit from musical training, because as you were talking, I realized that your experience as a musician, both as a performer but also as a audience member and collaborator, involves so much listening.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so important. And it's interesting to hear you talk about how the person is almost like a score, too. It reminds me of one of Glenn Gould's quotes, probably my favorite quote. It was something like, in the ideal world, there's no need for art because the person's life would be their canvas and that would be art, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very true. I mean, if you look at it like that, from that sort of artistic perspective, you're helping people improve their own like life as an art form. That's so cool. That's so commendable.
Yeah, there is a sense in which the framework of the psychoanalytic office is a place where that can unfold, where there is a complete openness by the therapist, hopefully, to anything and everything which the person might bring with them, which is, of course, includes especially things that they don't want to admit about themselves, things that they don't want to see, things that most of society doesn't want to see about each of us, and that's a place which is very accepting, very safe, and for that reason, I think it is a special setting and something that ought to be preserved in times where judgment is ever present, also on social media, and it's a world which is seemingly very liberal and open, but in reality, um, the insult, the ostracizing is behind the corner.
So we've talked about kind of the musical elements that go into your new line of work, but what about the inverse? Have you noticed how any of what you've learned and worked towards is affecting your music in return?
Sure, sure. I think very much, but I'm not sure that these are differences that the audience member that listened to me over the years can perceive, or
Hmm.
it definitely has changed the way that deeply, the way that I approach music and the way that I perceive the stage. But that's also part of that's beyond the theoretical training and the clinical training to become an analyst. That's also simply the result of one's own analysis, because to become a psychoanalyst, one has to undergo several years of analysis of one's own, and that means that, of course, you are constantly in touch with who you are, who you were, who you might become, and that's kind of a very interesting process. Can be unnerving, can be depressing at moments, can be very exhilarating at others. But it definitely changes your subjective position with regards to professional life, to family life, etc. This is something extremely personal and subjective, so I cannot speak in general. But I can say that my relationship to the stage has changed. It is more relaxed in a certain way, without having given up. I think, I hope, a kind of extreme interest in bringing out the meaning that I suppose each composer was trying to include with that ink. So, but yeah, definitely things change. I think whenever anyone adds another side to their musical profession, in this case perhaps more, because psychoanalysis goes to touch really the course of one's being, including in our case as musicians, for instance. Why am I a musician? What am I doing here?
Yeah.
Which is something which was anyway, I think, tested for all of us very much so during the pandemic months and then years. What are we? What are we without a stage, for instance? Are we needed in society when it seemed, especially at the beginning, that we were dispensable? So I think that for me simply coincided with this um, thinking about our role.
I love all that. And I'm bursting with questions. I'm trying to think of exactly which direction to take this here. But maybe a good one is like I'm imagining as a musician that you might wonder about some of the people who wrote the music in the past. Like, do you find that your new knowledge of this whole field has made you wonder about the frame of mind or the composers themselves behind some of these pieces of music? Like certain works, like Tchaikovsky 4, for example, seem probably to come from a world of depression or anxiety, or not to mention Beethoven losing his hearing and just these kind of behind the scenes psychological turmoil that so many artists seem to go through. I mean, I find myself wondering if they had access to better, treatment or healthcare like this,
Oh,
would their music have changed or what?
we might not have
Yeah,
had
what?
great symphonies.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't really know what my question is, but like, I guess, how do you reflect back on? You're talking about the past of music, I mean, and the interpretation of music with this sort of newfound career and knowledge path. I
Right.
mean,
I think for me it mostly mm, mm, augmented even more my respect for the score, for what comes, not just the printed score, but everything which feeds into it. Yeah, all the context, for instance, of performance practice, of musicological knowledge around the printed music, everything which goes there, which allows me to bring the music alive with, of course, with my subjectivity involved. It's there would be no other way to do it, yeah. But always to begin from from what I believe that the gestures mean. In the same way as if somebody would be putting up a Shakespeare play or something like this, we would really go from the words and try to catch all the double meanings and all the context of the Elizabethan situations. And I think as an analyst, you try to extract yourself as much as possible from the patient's life. It's not precisely a matter of empathy, because empathy can be very deceiving. We could think that we are empathic with somebody, but we're actually um, kind of going after our own meanings and our own memories and our own triggers rather than what the patient's life is and their own feelings. And I think that's the risk sometimes as we interpret music, that one can um, drown out or saturate the score with one's own feelings, which is great if they're somehow connected, if they find a place within the architecture of the piece as it was conceived. Psychoanalysis helped me, for instance, I think, to accept certain idiosyncrasies of specific composers or specific works, things that are really special and found only in a particular piece, for instance, which are really strange and unusual, which maybe I would have tried to hide or gloss over, even certain notes which might be different, which people tend to adjust to make everything more traditional or more predictable. Now I'm more open to the possibility that life is full of strange things and people are very different from one another, and there might be plenty of hints within a score that something ought to be performed without uh, smudging the corners or hiding a certain degree of strangeness or meaning that the composer had put there. Within the psychiatric and the psychoanalytic literature, of course, there are favorites. I mean, some people come up over and over again. Of course, I cannot count the articles and books written about Schumann's condition, diagnostic guesses about what Schumann's condition might have been, if bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, results of syphilis, and of course Tchaikovsky, etc. There are plenty of things you can go and try to diagnose past historical figures with an artist and so on. Um, I'm not sure that's super interesting. I think that can be quite deceiving when you don't have the person in front of you.
Yeah, totally.
And also I do believe that notes and scores, the same as paintings by an artist, they are in a world of their own in a certain way. They begin to walk with their own two legs once they leave the parental ink. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's a big topic, and it's a good question because it's a question I grapple with every day. How are these two sides of my these two passions and now these two career paths influencing one another?
Well, it's so funny to hear you talk. It made me actually just realize something about myself I've been trying to figure out. And that is, so one of my things I started over the pandemic was I've had like some songwriting projects I've worked on for years and never got anywhere, but I decided to try and actually bring them to fruition, sort of. So, but I've been talking with the person I'm working with, like the songwriting teacher, I guess, about this. And I'm like, I don't understand because I've performed so much over the years and like I put myself out there and do all these things, but like I have a severe anxiety about playing these for people.
Hmm.
And we couldn't really get to the bottom of it. But you just made me realize, I think, that it's because I've been on the performing side of the music, and this is my first side on the true creation side,
Right.
being vulnerable in that way, not performing someone else's. And I guess what you're saying is that the composer's emotions, you're responsible as the performer, not to kind of color it with your emotions, but to interpret their emotions and what they were feeling. And that's really interesting to me
Yeah.
because you're right. That for me now trying to be a songwriter in a way and work on these projects, or it's very different than performing a piece of clarinet music that was written by somebody else where I'm trying to,
Sure. I find the super interesting situation happens when you've got a superimposition, right? When you yourself are you're working out and performing your own material. Then you have this kind of doubling where you are the creator and the interpreter. And I mean, we have luckily, many examples of that in history, and of course, many documents of that through recordings. I mean, Stravinsky conducting his own works, Strauss conducting his own works, and Debussy playing his own works, and so on. So we can go back and listen from the beginning of the 20th century to all these great composers and people that we feel are almost mythological or from another era, but we have their recorded works, and how their performance differs from their notation. This is also fantastic. I mean, it's very often very far from their notation, including Stravinsky. Not very far, but including Stravinsky, he has, for instance, slightly different metronome markings than the ones he marks when he's the performer, the interpreter. So I think we are in any case divided, and we occupy, these are two different roles. So it's interesting that you notice that it's two. We are, and of course
Two
this
in
is
one.
what you this strangeness you experience would have been, I think, very foreign to people until the end of the 19th century, when everyone was a composer to some degree or other and a performer. I think part of the difficulty is that we have divided these roles up and sealed them away from one another quite tightly now, and that's a pity. Of
Yeah.
course, it's something that then as interpreters we have to fight to get back to that place where we can understand the process of creation and how one goes from music which is heard in the mind or somehow improvised to what is then laid down in cold ink. And in the past, that was not the case at all. Everybody was also a composer. So
You're totally right. Look back at the Baroque period where even like realizing a figured bass or like
sure.
markings were rarely used because you're right, there's no distinction really between the composer and the performer, because even if the piece is composed, you were kind of realizing it live in your
Yeah.
own sort of way. And
I
it's
guess
interesting too what you
like jazz,
go ahead,
right?
sorry.
In jazz, it
Yeah.
was a similar process where I think at the beginning, there was not a very tight division between the composers, arranger, and performer. Then maybe it became more specialized there as well. Once, of course, it became more academic as well.
Yeah, you're playing a tune, but you make it yours, kind
Yeah,
of, you know,
yeah,
make it your sort of version. So that's really, really interesting. So we kind of dodged a question though. What does your going forward, your life look like? Your balance of life? I mean, between being a father and musician and clinical
complicated.
psychoanalyst. I mean, I imagine
Complicated.
so.
Yeah. No, I mean
Yeah.
it's an experiment, of course, and it's an experiment I want to follow through with, and I'm very excited about. But it is new, so I am not sure how it will look like. My image of it is that I will still, of course, be performing. I love to play music, and I love to be on the stage. I love also to teach master classes and lectures and so on. So that part will stay, but it will diminish probably. It will go down. I mean, at the high point, I was having more than 100 concerts a year. And that was very exciting, and there was a lot of adrenaline um, with that. But that's not something I wish for any longer. Perhaps also a part of the effect of the psychoanalytic process, or a reevaluation after becoming a parent, and a reevaluation after COVID. I prefer to have fewer things, but to be able to devote myself more in depth to them, um, and maybe perhaps to have more variety. So I plan to still play many, many concerts a year, but much less than before. And then I plan to have patients. Of course, not as many as one therapist or analyst who would be full time involved in the profession, and all the things that come with patients. That means, of course, supervisions, one's own continued analysis, publishing papers, and going to international congresses, and staying up to date with the literature. Um, and then, yes, of course, being a family man and a father. So we'll see how that works. I believe it's possible. It's not so common, but I know of a couple other musicians who are also not analysts but psychotherapists, and they have been able to find a kind of balance with it. So I'm confident it can be done, but we have to see. Until we're thrown in the on the field, we don't know how the game will play out. So.
Totally. And I can totally relate to what you're saying about kind of finding the balance. I mean, it's interesting because after the pandemic, or sorry, just before the pandemic, I was going to take a year off of music essentially and just do the podcast because, I'm fortunate to have my job, and I was like, I kind of want to be just around. Like my kids are really young. It's an important time of life. And so I'd planned to take a year off of music. Little did I know it would turn into about 3 years, but I haven't really pursued going back because I don't really, and a lot of musicians can't understand this, but I don't want to find myself in the concert hall on every Friday and Saturday evening, for example, all summer. Or like I have friends right now playing multiple back-to-back shows of a musical. 8 shows a week for the entire summer in a hot little booth. And it doesn't sound attractive to me in my place of life right now. So I'm looking at it almost like a sabbatical. I can choose to go back, but currently I'm choosing to work on my own projects, my own musical interests, of which I never thought I'd have the time to do. So like, there's that old phrase. I can't remember it exactly, but it's something like, is that good news or bad news? Well, ask me tomorrow, because you don't know until
No.
you get to see it play out. And even the good news could be tomorrow's bad news, and the bad news might be good news. And I mean, look at hurting my hand years ago. It resulted in me kind of focusing down on the podcast because I couldn't play. So it just, you never know how things are really going to work out. And I've become kind of comfortable with that. And also to realize, and that's part of the book club. I started up the book club for the podcast again, which I'll just quickly plug right here. So we're reading The Music Lesson by Victor Wooten this month, which is actually, I'm really enjoying it. It's kind of interesting in the sense that he's kind of talking to some sort of spiritual guide or something. And but he kind of goes through the book. Yeah, there's no such thing, like a great musician isn't like a clarinetist. They're a musician no matter what they do, whether they're playing pots and pans or bass guitar. They can pick up something and make music because they are a musician, And so if you look at your life like that, yeah, you can you can do whatever you need to do to make it work, and there's no kind of shame in taking time away or time off or taking a sabbatical. I mean, university professors get a sabbatical. Why don't I?
Yeah, I think that was also a lesson of the pandemic for many of us. No, that things still go on. Some people, it was of course highly personal. Some people really suffered from not being able to access the stage, and for some people it was really extreme, the suffering. For others, it was a realization that they didn't need the stress of it, or there was all kinds of approaches to it. For me, it's very hard to separate what the effect was of the pandemic and this kind of big world event and everything that meant for musicians from the paternity, because becoming a father happened at the same time for me. So that's what complicates a little bit when I look back, what was what, trying to separate the effects of the world events from my very own little family. In any case, yes, the shift happened, and I agree with you. I mean, for me, it's the same. There is, of course, there was a certain blessing in seeing my daughter grow and to be with her daily for the first few months of her life. It was a luxury, we can call it that, yeah, in the context of the pandemic, but it was a certain luxury which I would have never given myself probably. Had the music world been churning and going on as it did at high pace because of fear of missing out, right? We want to be on the stage, and we want to play, and we want to say yes when we're called for something. So I'm not sure that I would have had the possibility the courage to do that. But since everything stopped, since everything was on hold, I think that allowed many of us to some degree or other, relax into the acceptance that was the current situation. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of an unprecedented thing. I don't know that many other generations have really experienced it in the way that we did, and it was very interesting and strange at the same time. I don't know. I just want to jump in here and say to the audience, there's 4 people still watching. We had 6 at one point, but 2 have bowed out. I don't know where they went, but in about 15 minutes, I'd like to do a couple listener questions. If not, of course, I can keep asking away as I do. But if you do think of anything, you can go ahead and post it in the chat, or you can, request to call in live. That's a new feature we're testing, and if you can find the button to do that, I will accept you to come on and ask a question, which would be really good. So, and those listening after the fact, these interviews are recorded live, and you can check them out at clarineat.com or on YouTube, the YouTube channel, to actually stream them and check them out. But if you want to be here live when they're happening, you can join that at clarineat.com/live after the fact. So let's not forget to talk about your music. So you have also a new CD out, or a new album, I guess. I'm dating myself.
Yeah, it's an album and a CD. Yeah, it's called Moonwalk. It's been out now for a while, but of course it came out. It was also a strange time for CD releases during the pandemic for a whole bunch of reasons. Also logistical problems, right? Bottlenecks and so on. But in any case, the CD came out. It's been out now over a year, And it was a real passion project for me and for my father. He's a pianist and conductor, and it's something I had kind of had as a desire since I was a child, or definitely a teenager, that one day it would be very nice to record something together, and specifically the Brahms Clarinet Sonata. I knew I wanted to do that with him. And then we decided to build a project around the Brahms sonatas, the Saint-Saëns sonata, and three little miniature pieces by Debussy, Busoni, and Reger. And out came this album, which was recorded before the pandemic, but of course came out quite a bit after. And as a matter of fact, our last editing session was in beginning of March of 2020, and we caught the last flight we could catch out of Germany to go back to Italy at that time. So it really was kind of sealing the old era. Yeah, it's an old streaming platform, so it can be heard on Spotify, Qobuz, Tidal. I believe it's on YouTube as well, or it can be purchased as a CD, which I highly advise, not for the purchasing aspect of it, but because of the notes, the CD notes, the booklet, which it's something I really lament that people don't have access to when we listen to music on streaming, unless you use a service like Qobuz and you're able to download the PDF. Then you are cut out of all the interesting stuff and original things, which are sometimes in good CD booklets. And I believe that our booklet is interesting actually in that way, because I don't know if you had a chance, Sean, to look through it, but it has it's kind of written out as a conversation between the five composers featured on the CD. And this conversation is using absolutely real materials from their own letters and criticisms and diaries and so on. So it seems like a conversation between them about specific musical topics. But as it turns out, it's not fictional at all. It's the concept of conversation is fictional, but the the texts are actually real by these composers. That was a labor of love for me, because you can imagine one has to read through thousands of letters and diary entries and so on to find what could be interesting and relevant to construct such a fictional conversation. But that's something that I lament, that people that access our recording on streaming services, that they don't get to read something which, in my mind, is actually an important part of the project.
The whole concept of an album is really getting lost. And I just pulled up your the PDF you sent me. I will read this in detail later. Then, now that I know the backstory, that's really, really interesting. But yeah, this is actually a little 36-page booklet that comes with the CD.
It actually reached the limit of it. We would not have been able to have more text in it.
Really?
And
Wow.
that was part of the difficulty when I spoke about logistical bottlenecks. The CD was ready, the texts were written, the graphics was made, and suddenly it could not go on the market because it was the lack of paper. I don't know if you remember, but around what was it, the summer of what was that?
2021,
I think. Yeah, I think in summer of 2021.
Shortages.
Yeah, there was shortages. Yeah, and we couldn't.
Yeah.
So it was a bit funny with this paper shortages. I never thought a CD would be held up because of that. But so yeah, but yeah, one can nowadays still produce, invent such an object as an album. The problem I see is that there is something dated about it. But the people that do buy albums, which there are still plenty of people who do, they really love the object, and it really means a lot, I think, to the people buying the CDs, that the object has a physical existence, and the notes and the image and the images and the artwork is accessible to them physically.
Well, it's so interesting too, because like I am a big CD collector still. I have a lot of CDs, and I've heard CDs are coming back though, almost the way that vinyl did, because people have sort of realized that CDs are actually a little more effective than vinyl. They're portable.
Yeah.
They're not going to have any, they don't get dirty. They're a lot smaller. They're actually a lot, I think they're a lot cheaper. Vinyl has kind of gotten ridiculous, but I also really like the CD. And one reason I do like it is because if I ever meet the artist too, I can get them to sign it. I mean, when I met Tom York of Radiohead there, he signed my copy of Kid A. I mean, that was a life altering moment. I still have it on my wall, like, so what do people get them to sign nowadays? Their iPhone? It's hey, can you sign my Spotify? Like,
that's a setting. That's a setting where we are still able to travel with CDs now to festivals, to concerts, and then when people hear us live, and the CD is available at the break or can be signed. That's a situation, as you say, where people are still perceiving the value of the object. And I'm with you. I love vinyl, and I have a big collection of vinyl. But for somebody like me who has had to move several times between countries, and it's it's a pain to travel with these kilos and kilos and kilos of records. So I definitely, I understand the beauty and the enormous wealth of information we can access through streaming. But we lose something as well there. So
it actually reminds me. I was thinking of. Sorry, go ahead.
No, nothing. I just saying that there is something a little bit utopic or utopistic about the idea of a physical support for music, but I still very much support it.
Totally. And I was just thinking, who was I talking to about this? And I realized it was actually in this book again. They actually had a really interesting moment between the two people where he said something like, a radio that receives all channels at once is not doing its job until it chooses to exclude almost everything except just what you want to listen to. And I thought, he said if it was getting all the music at once, it would be chaos. And to me, that's how it feels listening to Spotify.
Yeah.
Is I can't focus on what I'm listening to because I know that everything else is out there. And I find myself more easily bored by what comes up. Whereas when you put in a CD, like you pick a CD to take for in your car for the day, that's what you have to listen to for the day.
Yeah.
It's very, that focus, the way it kind of lasers you in on what you're listening to is actually, in my opinion, better. It's more effective way to enjoy art. So it requires intention and attention, which we don't have anymore. So like, for example, if your CD, if I put it in my player, I'm pretty much now committed, if I'm going to go for a walk, let's say with it, to listen to that for the next hour, unless I choose to stop listening to music. So I don't have every other composed piece of all time available to switch to if for some reason I get bored or don't like it or want to, you know what I mean? Like, it's very strange that we have allowed music to come to us like this, and that so many people seem to enjoy it.
There are some positive aspects, of course, but they just ought to be taken advantage of. For instance, when I teach interpretation of music, clarinetist and chamber music, I am so amazed at how lucky these young players are to have access, easy access, for instance, to all these historical recordings that I was mentioning before. You can listen to Mahler play his Fifth Symphony on the piano. It's this was impossible when I was a student in the university. It was not that long ago, and still I had to search these things out in the archives of the university library. And if I didn't have it, I had to order it, and maybe it was not in print anymore. Now that we do have access to all these things on YouTube, really on the palm of our hands, I do encourage, especially young people who are training as musicians, to go out there and find these things and listen to them and develop their own opinions about what they like and dislike, and realize what a big variety in interpretation there can be. That things were much less standardized than they are today. So that's for me a little strange, the fact that we have all this information available, but the push or the destiny of interpretation has been towards a higher standardization. And back then, when they had little to no access to things besides live music, the differences were very big between one interpreter and the other, or between one interpreter's interpretation and his same interpretation 1 year later. So there are positive things. We just have to reach for them.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. It's just a matter of, for me, focusing in on what we really want to do, and the hard part is choosing what to exclude, I suppose.
Yeah, for sure.
When you have infinity at your fingertips, that's
absolutely. Just today,
if used wisely.
Just today, I was listening to the end of Histoire du Soldat. There is this moral in text, the poetry, and it says
Hmm.
something along the side of you cannot have the past and the present as well, and one one happiness is great, but if you have two happinesses, they cancel each other out. So there is something about the exclusive aspect of a happy moment or something beautiful is very limited. It is a single thing. It doesn't have the possibility to be there alongside something else. And the fact that today we are inundated, if we want, also even with beauty, can detract value from it. So I thought of this. My association was with these words. That if you just because it's kind of what Victor Wooten is saying, as I understand it, also about radio stations, that you have to operate a process of selection, and then you can access some degree of meaning. But otherwise, it's just cacophony. Yeah, it's just the
Yeah.
simultaneous presence of everything at once, even if it's beautiful. I mean, at least in the kitchen, it doesn't work.
It's overwhelming. Yeah, you can't just put everything in the pot and have a
No,
good
no.
meal. It takes planning and yeah, that's a great analogy actually. I love cooking analogies. There was also an Onion article yesterday. This is right on point. It said something like, "Woman trying to live in the moment continues to get interrupted by future moments," or something like
That's great. Yeah, yeah.
that. Yeah,
That's great.
I
Yeah.
laughed. I was like, "That's so true. That's the challenge: being present in the moment that's still coming."
Right, right,
That's
right.
the weird part.
That's important for us,
So.
especially on the stage, not just in life.
Absolutely. So before I move on, I've got 10 questions at the end here I want to quickly ask, kind of rapid fire, and then we'll do some listener questions. It looks like we got 5 people here now, which is great. So listeners, think of something to ask and post it in the chat or tune in, call in, I mean. But I just wanted to quickly ask, is there something that you wish I would ask that I didn't ask that you want to bring up today on the show?
Um, no, no, I was very happy with our conversation. I think we need
Yeah, it's very
to
interesting.
exercise the ability to select and leave things out.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the takeaway, I think. Do you have any questions for me?
No, it was just
No?
great. I
Okay.
mean, it was a
Okay.
surprise to see that we have this new format now. I wasn't prepared for it, and I'm
I'm
happy.
sorry, I meant to mention, yeah.
But I'm
I
happy.
meant to
I'm happy
mention
that
that.
we're also moving on. That things change. That this is also a good sign that we are fluid.
Yeah, I did. I had to do a lot of thinking. As I closed up the podcast for at the end of last year, I just kind of realized that a lot has changed in 8 years, and it seems like it has to go video. And what does that mean for me? And I'm also really sick of social media. And how can I create kind of a bit of a community without spending all my time on Facebook? And so this live platform that lets people tune in to me is a much more intimate experience. And then, of course, though, this will go live on YouTube later for kind of the mass consumption out there in the wild. But so, I've got 10 questions, and maybe someday I'll assemble these all into a little blog post or something that we can hear what everyone had to say. But I don't think I had any sort of lightning round back in the day when you first came on. So these hopefully are all new, but we'll see. What is your very first or most profound musical memory?
For me, it has to do with the home, with music being made at home, because there were many musicians in my family, and kind of the feeling of waking up in my bed, warm, comfortable, and hearing some Chopin or Schumann being played on the piano across the wall. Um, that's, I think, what has stayed with me of music is this very cozy domestic aspect of it.
I love that, comforting almost, and I love how that album is with your father. Actually, I meant to mention that I'm having James Campbell on soon. It turns out his
Ah,
son is a guitarist, and they did an album together too, and have worked together for years. So
many greetings to
real
James.
family affair here.
Yeah.
um, what is the best piece of musical advice you ever got, and who gave it to you? Or what is a piece of advice you think people should ignore?
Uh-huh. Um, Actually, the best, I'd say hard to say the best, of course, because any moment I could come up with something different. But I'll speak about something very simple that Eric Oeprich, the early clarinetist, or periodist when clarinetist, told me when I met him many years ago in Amsterdam. I went to visit him, and I was unsure about my career path at the time. And he says, What do you like? What do you like to do?" And he said, "Well, I like to play chamber music." I said, "Okay, then go for it." And I mean, it's something so simple. It's really, but very often these simple moments they can mark. And for me, that was a simple moment that had an effect, because until that moment, I just didn't think one could be a chamber musician as a clarinetist. And of course, this came from Eric, who had been, the pioneer of the early clarinet. So he had invented the whole thing, how to build the instruments, how to play them. So this was really somebody who had been courageous with his choices, had moved from the US to Europe to be in the early musical scene. Um, so when he told me that, and I thought, well, what am I going to do? I mean, if I'm lucky, I'll be an orchestral musician, which would have been fine, no doubt, also. But actually, I just went for this chamber music direction, and it worked out for me, career-wise as well. And I'm very thankful that that happened and that was possible. So I think back to Eric, and I would like to thank him for that, because I think it's the most obvious thing, but I think sometimes young people need to hear it. Well, what do you want? And if it's not there, let's find ways of creating it, or let's find ways
Absolutely.
to to connect with people that can help you construct this niche, and so on. So that would be that, I think.
I love that. And it's totally true. And I think for me, a big thing has been realizing that your career path doesn't have to be the same as your teachers or your colleagues. And indeed it can't be, because it's your career,
Yeah.
So it's got to be something new or different. And also the hardest thing, which came latest for me, was that people also don't need to understand it. As long as you understand it and it works for you,
Sure.
it doesn't really matter what they think,
Yeah.
So, what piece of music or album specifically changed your life the most? Is there one that stands
I
out?
I often think about Richard Stoltzman's Copland Concerto. There was a series, a mini series of, I believe, 6 episodes, which was done by the BBC in the early 90s, mid 90s. And it was called Concerto. And Dudley Moore, the pianist and comedian, he was kind of the presenter of that. And in each episode, there would be a different concerto with a great soloist from the time. James Galway was there, and Alicia de la Rocha, and always it was still St. Thomas with the London Symphony. And it was a great 1 hour show where the first part was all the musicians meeting and coming up with an interpretation and interviews and jokes, and you really could see this piece coming to life. And at the end, it would follow a whole performance done in a very theatrical way by the BBC. And I just remember the Copland Concerto and how Dick Stoltzman was playing it, and it was wow. Never heard something like that when I was a young kid, 9, 10 years old. Um, so I think that that gave me well, a certain increased my love for the clarinet. And then when I met Dick Stoltzman later, it was yeah, like one of these times in lives which I've been quite lucky to have a few times of meeting a childhood hero. Um, so I'd have to go with that moment, and which brings me to say that I think television should offer these kind of programs, because I think I'm not the only one who was so touched by good cultural programming on television.
Yeah, it's something lacking these days, it seems.
Yeah.
To say the least.
Yeah, yeah.
Have you ever cracked a clarinet? If so, what's the story? And if not,
Ooh,
what's your secret?
yes. I mean, I've had many instruments in my life by now, and many of them cracked at a point or another because of weather or because of, well, sometimes not being smart about it. Yeah, coming with a very cold instrument and quickly playing it in a warm environment. With period instruments, with historical instruments, which I also play, they're mostly made of boxwood, and it's a wood which absorbs a lot of water. So when I've had recording sessions with historical instruments being played for many hours a day in a recording session, they suffer from this. But the latest crack I've had was very silly. I dropped a clarinet. It fell on its bell, luckily. So it was just the bell that needed to be replaced. But hey, that's what insurance is for, and that's it.
So, what's your care routine for your instruments? Do you use like orange peels or some sort of humidipack, or what do you?
Well, the places I've lived, most of the time, I don't need to be that careful, because Denmark, for instance, is
Okay.
is quite humid or not crazy humid, but quite humid all year round. So there is not really a problem with dryness. When I actually find myself with the dry problems is when I come to New York City or
Mm.
some places in North America during the winter where they use heavy heating systems that are drying out the air. But honestly, I believe that I'm just there long enough that I suffer from it more than the instrument does. I mean, in the concerts you
Yeah.
can feel the dry throat and I do humidify the reeds. That's what I do when I come to New York City, for instance, in the winter. But it's something I don't need to do mostly when I'm in Europe.
And for the reeds, are you using like your own sort of invention? I mean, I think it was Richie Hawley who came on and he'd invented some kind of little
Uh,
reed box or something. Or
I have
what are
this
you using?
this plexiglass. I think it's called Reeds and Stuff, the maker. It's a German maker, and you can keep 10 reeds in this kind of plexiglass environment with a hygrometer and a sponge. And I think it's quite handy, and it's nice to have it, even though I only use it mostly in emergencies. The sponge and the hygrometer. It's I have a digital hygrometer in my Clarinet case, and I do find that's useful. It also tells temperature. And so when I come to a new place that I don't know so well, I immediately know pretty accurately which barrel I should be using and how far to pull out and so on, because now I have some feeling and knowledge about the instrument, how it deals with different temperatures and humidities.
Very interesting. So those in the watching here, I've got 5 more questions I can whip out if we need, but I want to give the chance if you do have a question to click that call in button, and you can ask it live on air here. So if you're brave or willing or interested, go ahead and do that, or you can comment it in the chat. You don't have to, and I got some more I can line up here if we need them. Let's start with some of these extra ones. So, if you had to live every day of your life by a single quote, which would it be?
I think I don't know who said this. It's a very famous quote. I don't know if it was Socrates or now it'll be it should be an obvious one, but it's this know thyself. I think that especially with my psychoanalytic passion and future as a clinician, um, I think knowing oneself, getting to learn to construct one's story, one's narrative, um, interpreting one's life, and figuring out that there is no bottom to it. Yeah, that there is always some surprises, unexpected things, good and bad, and so on. But being engaged with one story, I think that's very important. And I think for a musician, it's crucial, yeah, that we are engaged with the music, with the composer's story, and with whatever is laid out on the page for us, and with the people around us, with our colleagues, both on a human level but also as good listeners, as good conversation partners in chamber music and the orchestra, and so on.
I don't think you could have picked a better quote with your whole multi-career path here, and it's true actually. It's if it's hard to know yourself, it's crazy that we can think we know other people. Isn't that
Yeah,
crazy?
but we do. You can live life very well without knowing much about yourself or other people. It's possible. It's absolutely possible, but it's not
Yeah,
as fun. I think it's not as engaging as being open.
totally. If you could go back in time and have dinner with any person in history, who would it be?
Again, tough to choose, huh? But um, I would actually say Freud.
Hmm.
Again, because I think Freud left us so many writings, and the complete works are in the couple of tens of thousands of pages. But so we know what he thought, and we know his process, and but still, with all his faults and all his genius, I I would have liked to meet the man, have a dinner with him, and ask him some questions, and um, because I think he was a special man. He was somebody who was had a way to construct and understand the human psyche, which undeniably has had more effect on mental health than anyone before or after him.
If you could start your career over again, what other career might you choose if you couldn't do music? I mean, I think we might have an idea.
Well, no, I'll leave psychoanalysis out of it because I think that
Okay.
it's not fair since that's already. Um, well, I love history actually. I was always interested in social studies, and I think psychology, music also with its historical aspect and historical performance practice. So maybe I would have been some kind of historian or something like that. But I must say it's difficult for me to. Then I would have had to teach and to have a very good constant contact with other historians and with students because I think what I love in everything I do in music as in the psychoanalytic circles and clinical work is that you are working with human beings all the time. And yes, there is lots of studying, lots of practicing behind closed doors. But this is not what I'm what I where I get most of my energy from. It's something that has to be done, and it's actually great to do it. But so for that reason, I think anything I would do would need to have this practical aspect of being constantly in touch with others and in dialogue.
The personal connection is so important no matter what you choose.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, it reminds me. There's a band I like locally in Canada here called Matthew Good, and he his first album, not really album, but like EP, I guess, years ago released was called History Teacher because he always thought he'd be a history teacher.
Yeah.
So it kind of reminds me of
Yeah.
that. But so what do you do outside of music? What are your hobbies on the weekend, or what
Well,
what else makes you tick?
honestly, there isn't that much besides everything I've told you because
It sounds like you're pretty busy.
yeah, I mean, when in these years, being a father and a musician, actually more than full time, plus the my training, my studies, that has meant that I'm very busy in the evenings when I'm not playing concerts. I'm studying, I'm attending classes, I'm reading a lot and studying and writing articles, and so it's in this moment, it's not boring at all. It's very exciting because I'm involved with my studies and I'm always trying to understand, especially as I dive onto the active like clinical side of it. I feel the urgency of finding out more and learning more and more from other clinicians and practitioners. So in the moment, honestly, it's just living out these two passions and spending wonderful, relaxed time with my family when I can cut out these moments with them. That's it.
Okay, fair enough. That makes perfect sense. I can relate. Although I still try to stuff too much in. I'm trying to do like gardening and
Nice.
all sorts of
Yeah,
things.
yeah.
And it's like, oh man, where do you need 26 or 30 hours a day sometimes? So last question here. What is something about you, such as a collection or experience or a celebrity you've met or anything that I would just never think to ask about, never guess?
Well, there was a funny story now. I mean, it just came out randomly because you said if I've ever met a celebrity, let's say a real celebrity, yeah, outside of our classical music colleagues. No, I was playing a concert in Copenhagen, and I was wearing kind of a fancy jacket, and I feel these fingers on my shoulder while I'm having coffee just before my concert in the coffee shop, and I turn around and it's the lead singer of Aerosmith, Steve Tyler.
Oh wow.
Steve Tyler. I mean, you couldn't mistake him for anybody else because it was like July and he had a fur coat and black nail polish and I mean his face, yeah. And then he's like, "Hey man," I was like, "Okay, hey Steve," and so, "Where did you get that coat?" I got it in New York. Oh, yeah, I know that man, but I mean, who made it? And I said, okay, it was John Varvatos. And then he turns to like some friends he had in the corner, and he's like, "You see, guys, I told you it was John Varvatos." It's a completely silly story, but I felt literally brushed by greatness there. Especially because
That's
that
super funny.
same evening I was playing together with my colleagues for like a couple thousand, maybe 1,000 people. Or so it was for us a good big classical concert. But then, of course, the next day I read in the papers that he had played the Royal Arena, which I think is 35,000 people. So that was nice. And at the end, he said, "All right, man, rock on." And I said, "You too, rock on, Steve." So, but
That's
that was funny and
crazy.
very unexpected. I can tell you that
That's
when you're
funny.
faced with him.
That was just randomly on the street
Well, it
somewhere?
was in Tivoli, which is the amusement park.
Oh,
And a
okay.
few moments before that, my colleague saw him. He was, having this huge pink cotton candy, eating it in the street. He was just having a good time, waiting for his gig.
Yeah.
But I guess, I found out we had the same jacket, and of course, I praised that jacket even more since he touched it. So, but
That's
that's a
super
very
funny.
silly story about mythical creatures.
I love this question because I hear the craziest stuff. I learned all about Jerome Bunke has like some weird Tupperware collection, old Tupperware or something, and it's Richie Hawley again. He I guess once sat in front of Michael Jackson at a concert
Yeah.
or something. Speaking of Michael Jackson, I meant to ask your whole album concept, Moonwalk. Not
Right.
to loop back too far, but you mentioned how it's sort of about looking back at music, but we're kind of moving forward. Like it appears like we're looking back, even though we're looking forward.
Mm.
Was that a Michael Jackson
It is a
reference?
Michael Jackson
Kind of
reference.
to the whole.
I mean, it's a reference to Michael Jackson's dance move, which is something which
Yeah. Okay.
in itself he took from the people were doing it before him in simplified forms and so on, and
Yeah.
he took it and perfected it and really made it famous, right? I mean, when we think of the moonwalk, then it is Michael Jackson moonwalk. But the way that this came up to me was by simple association because I was thinking about the music on the CD. For instance, the Brahms, but also Saint-Saëns. These are sonatas which are written very late. I mean, the Brahms are written, of course, in the 1890s, but Saint-Saëns in the 1920s, and it's music which sounds much older. It's you cannot think that Saint-Saëns was composed 10 years after Rite of Spring or after Pierrot Lunaire and so when I thought of this, I thought that there is something, the importance of looking back and of inheritance, and the importance of connecting with our past and building something which is of the present, even though we are accessing our past. Yeah? And this was, of course, a reference to the dance move itself, where it looks when Michael Jackson does the move, it looks like he's walking forward, but he's actually going backwards. So there is this. There are both elements in the dance move, and that's what attracted me to it as a title. And of course, the aspect of inheritance is present because of the partnership between me and my father on the CD. As a duo between father and son, the question of inheritance and the transmission of musical passion is there as well.
I love that. So much thought put into it. Well, thank you so much, Tommaso, for coming on the
Thank you,
program
Sean. It was a
today.
pleasure.
Where can people? Yeah, absolutely. Where can people check you out online and they can stream your album, I guess, but also can they buy the CD directly on your
Sure,
website
you
or?
can find information on my website. That's www.lonquich. It's my last name. You can see it in the video. .com. And then yes, you can stream it on every platform, and you can buy it. I believe you can even find it on eBay or Amazon. But otherwise, you can order it from the Nova Antiqua, which is the label, and who has, by the way, a very wonderful policy for pricing, where they send you the CD for free, and then you pay something as you wish after you've heard the CD, and you value as you wish the experience of listening to it. So I
Oh,
find that a
wow.
very nice format, and one of the reasons that I love the Nova Antiqua label here in Italy.
That's even better than the Radiohead way back in the day. They launched that concept back in like 2007 of the pay what you
Right.
want. And I remember I was one of the fans who paid nothing, I have to say, because I was like, I don't know if I'm going to like the new album. However, I did order the big box set or whatever,
They got you.
which was like yeah, they got me. And I went to like 4 concerts on that tour, so they got me somehow.
Yeah.
But that's so interesting. Like put a value on it now that you know the work.
Yeah.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Very, very
Yeah,
cool.
it's a way to detach, the this market idea, the market value of something which is artistic. How can you give it
Yeah,
value? I
yeah.
mean, you can listen to it and then understand what this means for you. And I think that's a very wonderful, new and honest way to do it.
That is so interesting. Well, thank you so much again for coming on today. Out of respect for your time and everybody's watching, I appreciate everybody, the audience, you for coming on, and everyone for taking the time to be here today. And look at that, we're just about on an hour again.
Excellent.
I'm keeping these pretty good.
Thank you, Sean. It was a pleasure, and until next time.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye now. Be
Absolutely.
well.
Hopefully not 5 years.
No, I hope not.
Bye-bye.
Many things might happen. Yeah, ciao.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Sooner than that. Bye-bye. The Clarineat podcast is brought to you in part by one of my favorite products ever, Boveda two-way humidity control packs. I live in a super dry and cold climate in Canada, and so taking care of my instruments is a real challenge. However, it's effortless with Boveda. Every 3 months, I just replace the Boveda pack in my case, and I know my clarinets will be comfy and cozy inside. If you use cane reeds, there's also a mini version that fits inside most reed cases and keeps your reeds at their best, so they're ready to play when you are. Check out Boveda's offerings for clarinetists at bovedainc.com and use code Clarineat at checkout to save 10% on your next purchase. Click the link in the description below to learn more.